My name is Chris E, and I'm making a 3D puzzle platformer called Nectar. This video will be a little different than the other videos I've made. In my previous devlog I talked about the tightrope that I made, so I will come over here and just show you what I'm talking about. So I have these little posts here. I can interact with them, and it puts me into aiming mode, and then I can attach this rope. And right now it doesn't do anything, but if it is in the Nectar, then this tightrope spawns, and then I can jump on it and walk on it. It springs up and down like a tightrope. And a lot of people have been asking me how I did this. They wanted a more in-depth look at my blueprints, and I kind of previewed my blueprints a little bit in the devlog, but I just wanted to give a little closer look at it, just in case some of you people wanted to try to replicate it. So if you're up for a more technical video, this is what this video is going to be. And I don't really plan on doing a full tutorial right now. I'm not too confident in my tutorial making skills, but I don't know, I'll never say never. If sometime down the road I feel like I should, then maybe I will, but right now it's not in my plans. So let's get into it. So let's take a closer look at my blueprint. Just a heads up, it's a little disorganized. I wouldn't call myself an expert at anything, really. So it might be a bit of a mess, but I just wanted to take you through each part. So let's start with the begin play. So when you begin playing the game, a bunch of these functions run. So this one here sets the arrow direction that will determine the direction that the tightrope will spawn. So I have a set world rotation node for this arrow, and I have all this vector stuff to kind of rotate it the way I want it to rotate. And I determine the rotation with these start and end attach points. Those are just collision sphere components in my actor, and those points are set according to where the player decides to attach the tightrope. So to set those locations, I just use world location, and that's how I do that. I also set the length of the tightrope as the length of the vector between the 2 points, and that's how I get the vectors between the tightrope. This next function here is set player attach. So I have this other component in the actor called player attach. It's just a static sphere mesh that doesn't actually render, and it has no collision or anything. It does simulate physics though, and it has a physics constraint. And the physics constraint is using a linear motor with a 500 strength just to keep it in place when it moves. So it's always trying to stay at the 0 position. And that's what ends up causing the bounciness of the tightrope. But this player attach, I always spawn it. It really doesn't matter where it spawns in the beginning, but I just spawn it in the middle between the 2 start and end points. So that's what this length divided by 2 is. So it spawns there. It doesn't matter where it spawns because I'll show you later when the player actually jumps onto the tightrope, this moves around to where the player is. This node here will become important later on. I'll touch upon it later. The next one is set box collisions. So I have a few box collisions in the actor. So I have this trace box, this gravity box, and this Nectar box. They're all just showing up here because they don't have them set in position yet. It only gets set once the tightrope is spawned. So here, if I show the collisions, see all the collision that I have set up, and you can see this little plane here are all those collision boxes that haven't been set yet. But if I attach this, then you can see all of them. So this big one here is the gravity box. This smaller one here is, I believe, the trace box. Actually, I think this smaller one is both the trace box and the Nectar box. So the Nectar box detects whenever the Nectar is overlapping with it, and it spawns the tightrope when it overlaps. The trace box detects the player, so I originally had the line trace running on tick, but to make it more performant, if you're not interacting with the tightrope, I don't want it to be running. So it's only running when the player overlaps with this trace box to detect the player. And then the gravity box is a thing that it's like sort of a magnetic effect to pull the player a little bit towards the tightrope to make it easier to land on. So you saw there, I was staying to the side, but it kind of pulled me towards it a little bit. Like that. So those are those 3 boxes, and this function is just setting those boxes. So it moves them to the halfway point, and then it adjusts their size based on the length of the tightrope. So the next function I have is the one that creates the spline points. So to make this tightrope, I'm using spline points, and I wanted to be able to create and move the tightrope to different points, which is why I clear the spline points every time. And then when I want to spawn the tightrope again, then I create these spline points from scratch again. But yeah, this is just adding the spline points, setting the spline point type to linear because I didn't want them to have weird curves going on. And I just spawn a spline point every 25 feet, I believe, or 25 units, I believe. I have this this variable here. Oh no, 15. It's 15 units I spawn a spline point. Still just a blank spline right now. There's no spline mesh on it. And I'll come to that later. I guess this one first. So I spawn the particles, and this is the particle systems that activate when the tightrope despawns. So when it despawns, a bunch of petals come out, and those are these particles. So I'm just spawning the systems right now, each spline point for that. And then next is the spline mesh. The spline mesh here, I'm spawning onto the spline and attaching it to it. So for this, I destroy the previous spline mesh every time I spawn it. I clear the array that I have here. And then with the previous ones destroyed and the array cleared, I create new spline meshes at every spline point. So this is just setting the start and end of the spline meshes, each segment of the spline mesh. So I have a for loop for that. There are plenty of tutorials on how to set the start and ends of the spline meshes. So next, I spawn the flowers. So this, you might not necessarily need this for your tightrope that you're trying to implement, but for me, I wanted to have flowers along the tightrope. And the way I did it was I just spawned a flower at each spline location. So again, I did the same thing that I did for the spline mesh, but these are just static meshes now. So I'm spawning a static mesh component, and then I'm setting the location of those static mesh components at the spline point locations. So that's what this is, setting the rotation, because I spiral the rotation around the tightrope. After spawning the flowers, I set the scale for the spline mesh and the flowers because I needed an animation for the vine to grow. So that's what this one does. So it sets these scales. Some of these nodes I'm not using anymore, but yeah, I set the scales, and then for each loop, I set the scale that I set these variables to. So I do that for the spline mesh, that's what this is, this whole thing here. And then I guess I do the flowers later on. I don't do it here. But then I also spawn this cable, so when you're aiming the tightrope, this cable, I have this cable component right here. And that cable component doesn't have any functional purpose. It's just visual, but it helps sell the idea that it's a rope. And this function here scales the cable depending on whether the tightrope is within the nectar or out of the nectar, and it changes the color of the cable as well. So I have morph targets for the scaling of the loop that the bee is carrying, and I also have a morph target for the flowers that are on the loop. And I set the scale of the cable component. I do that all using a timeline. And then these are setting this is the green color and this is the brown color. And then it just sets some things for whether or not the cable is attached or not. So the visibility of things, the collision of things. So that's what happens at begin play. Let's go down to the line trace. So this is the line trace. Again, this is the overlap of that trace box. It only does this line trace if you're overlapping with that trace box. So there's some conditional things to decide whether it should do the trace or not. And then this is the actual trace itself. It's starting at the start point, so the arrow is located at the start point. And then it finds the direction of the arrow that we set in the beginning, and it does a line trace in that direction for the length that we also set in the beginning. So that's what all of this stuff does. It also only traces if the player is traveling at negative 100 unreal units in the Z direction. That way you can jump through the tightrope from the bottom and it won't attach. It'll only attach if the player is moving downward. And then if the line trace hits the player, then this whole thing activates. So it basically just snaps the attach point to the player location along the line, attaches the camera, it attaches the player to the attach point, sets the movement mode to none because I didn't want it to register as walking or falling or anything. This also stops the velocity of the player. This sends some information to the my player actor to tell the player that you are on a tightrope. It also sends something to the animation blueprint to tell it to change to the bouncing on the tightrope animation. And if the line trace doesn't hit, then it just loops back around to the beginning until it hits or until you're no longer in this trace box, and it stops the line trace. And then once you're attached to the tightrope, this is run on tick, but I have some conditions. So it only runs if the player is attached, and this sets the location of the spline points. So I have one condition for if the player is before the spline point and one for if the player is after the spline point. That determines like the Z position of the point. And then I have all this math here, which is pretty complicated. I'll do like a zoom out so you can see the whole thing, and you can like freeze frame this or do whatever you want to look at it. And then I'll do some closer shots in case it's too far out. So feel free to pause and rewind and look at this however you want, if you want to try to set this up yourself. So that updates based on the position of this player attach sphere thing that the player is attached to, which is on the physics constraint. So that player attached sphere is bouncing up and down, and then all these spline points are kind of following based on where that sphere is. That's what all this is doing. And then down here, it updates the spline mesh based on that updated spline. So again, I'll do kind of a further out shot. This one's a little smaller, so you might be able to see it all in one go. And then I will do a slightly zoomed in. So that's how I get the tightrope to look like it's bouncy. Now to move the player when you're on the tightrope, because I have the movement mode set to none of your input is going to work, your player input. So I had to do like a custom thing. So these input X and input Y are fed from my player actor just using a blueprint interface. So wherever you have your X and Y input in your actor, your player actor, just feed it into a blueprint interface as floats, and then you can output them into this. And then I use those inputs to not move the player, but to move the attach point. So some more conditional stuff. I get very specific with some of these things because my situation is very specific, but you could probably be more general in a lot of your cases. But this is controlling the animation that's playing. So if you're on the tightrope, then I'm using a blend, an animation blend. I forget what Unreal calls it, but it's a blend space, I think. And to blend, I need the speed that you're traveling. So this is what that is. This is feeding into my animation blueprint to determine the speed of the animation that should play. This one up here stops the blueprint animation from playing the tightrope animation if you're off of the tightrope. And then this is what actually moves the player, or the attach point. I'm setting the world location of the attach point just based on all of this vector math here. Again, I'll do a zoom out. So these inputs are feeding into a multiplier that multiplies based on these vectors. And then that all adds up into one vector, one location that this attach point is set to. And then I do a similar thing for the camera. So I'm attaching the camera to this camera attach rope component. So I'm just setting the location of that as well. And then this thing here is just to make sure that the attach point is rotated in the correct way that I want the player to be rotated to. So just some conditional stuff to figure out which direction the player is pointing towards. So that's just based on the direction of the camera and the direction of your player input from your controller. And that sets the rotation one way or the other way. And then down here, I have the jump command from the tightrope. So this is another blueprint interface from my my player actor. It's just taking the jump input, and whenever you push jump, it sends it to the blueprint interface that sends it to here, and then this whole thing activates. So I detach the player from the attach point. I set the rotation of the player to make the player like level, so you're not angled weirdly. I change the movement mode back to falling so that you'll have gravity again. And then I send some things back to the player actor, and I send some things back to the animation blueprint. And then here I add a little bit of a force to the attach point so that it bounces a little bit. When you jump, then the tightrope kind of reacts a little bit. And then I launch the player. So this just launches the player 350 units, which is equal to the jump force of my player character. You can change this based on however your character jumps. But then this is added to the direction that you're pushing your input. So this is just pulled from that input thing. And then that's all added together to this jump vector. And that launches the character upwards, and they jump off the tightrope. And then I have this little short thing here to bounce the tightrope every time you take a step. So this is linked to the animation blueprint, which has a notify in the animation itself. So every time the animation has the character stepping down, there's a notification thing that activates, and that gets sent here. And every time that happens, a downward force is applied. And then this is more stuff for like growing and shrinking. I think this is probably less applicable to a lot of people. This is very specific to my game. If you want to look at it, I'll do a zoom out. I'm not going to go into detail with it though. Again, this is to grow and shrink the flowers. Again, very specific to my thing, but I will do a zoom out. And this is for aiming the tightrope, and a zoom out of this. This down here controls what happens when I attach and detach the tightrope. So this bottom one basically sets all that stuff that I had set at begin play to attach the tightrope. So you have all these functions here. And this top one despawns the tightrope, so it destroys all the spline meshes, it gets rid of the spline, that kind of thing. And I think that covers everything for this tightrope. Maybe there's some things that I missed. If there's still stuff that you don't know about or that you have questions on, feel free to ask in the comments. I'll try to answer everything I can. Again, I'm not an expert, so I may not be able to solve some of the bugs that you have if you're having trouble. But if you need like closer zoom-ins on some of these, I can see what I can do. But yeah, that's the rundown of my tightrope. And I know it's pretty complicated. Good luck in creating your own tightropes. I'm sure some of you are better at this stuff than I am, so maybe come up with a simpler solution. But for now, thanks for watching. If you want to support Nectar, I have a Steam page, you can go there and wishlist the game. If you want to join the community, I have a Discord, which is actually probably the easiest way for me to answer your questions. If you join that, then we can have a discussion and I can send you screenshots maybe. There's a link to that in the description. And if you want to see more videos, then subscribe and hit the bell. Thanks.